So we're trying a little bit of a virtual connection here too, folks, so hopefully this goes along smoothly. It'll be great. So I just want to thank everybody who are in the buyer work group meeting right now. And I wanted to first start by reviewing what this group discussed last year and reminding everybody, because it's directly relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. So I just wanted to first go through the history of the buyer work group. It started actually with Wes saying this is something that we need to be talking more about. And we started informally with a few calls in 2017. And then if you were at the meeting in Baltimore, you'll remember that we had a buyer panel during the annual meeting. And the idea of that panel was for people to articulate, for buyers to talk about some of their challenges and some of the things that they're looking for when they're sourcing produce when it comes to food safety. And Steve, who's here, was part of that panel. And it was well received, but it was also clear from that we needed to take a bit more action and take some of those challenges that were articulated and move them forward. Oh, Jamie also is part of that panel, and he's here today. And so after that, we came together last year in Albany and had a dedicated work group meeting to the buyer topic, where this group got together and spoke and went through some challenges. And so in order to inform that conversation, if you were part of that group last year, you'll remember we sent out a questionnaire ahead of the meeting to the people who were registered to attend and asked what specific things they thought were challenging their growers and the buying community, and what kinds of specific items did they want to talk about in the meeting last year. And we used that information to frame and form the conversation specifically. And it was done that way so that what we did was output oriented. It wasn't just a discussion to continue talking about the challenges, but rather to figure out a way that we could then address some of those challenges. And so out of that meeting last year came you good? Oh, that should work. Yes. Okay, so out of that meeting, I'm just going to quickly review what the questionnaire showed. There was a lot about what's going on at the retail level in terms of consumer education. I think the word that showed up in the notes was grimy a lot, that consumers are grimy, I don't know. And there was a lot of confusion. This is I'm just going to reiterate, this is what was in the questionnaire. So ahead of the meeting last year, these are the responses that came from the questionnaire of what people wanted to talk about. Confusion between audits and inspections, state-specific audits, buyers are adjusting to having multiple audits, but there's still some confusion, and then buyer perspectives on audits versus inspections. And so you'll remember that we spent a great deal of time going through literally every single state in the room, and Betsy took the time to put it onto a flip chart, and we asked questions, went through and asked questions like, how many inspectors do you have on staff? How many covered farms do you have in your state? How many inspections do you plan to do each year? How many qualified, exempt, and exempt farms do you anticipate inspecting, or are you getting requests for inspections? Are you planning to give any type of certification or recognition of doing an inspection in order to meet buyer requirements? Did you adopt state authority directly from FSMA? Did you adopt it with some variation on your own? Are you credentialed? So there was a lot of discussion going through, pulling out every single state and asking those questions. And what that highlighted was that there was an enormous amount of variability between states, not only in how many inspection staff they have, but how many inspections would be conducted, what type of information they were going to be giving. And that was, I think, very awakening to the group. There was a lot of conversation about how people didn't realize that there was quite that amount of variability. So after we went through the state by state walkthrough, we went through and asked the buyers who were in the room to contribute their process and what they were asking their growers for in order to be selling into their stores. And those that were there said yes, that they were going to be asking for an audit or some type of certification from an inspection in order for growers to be able to sell into their stores. And so then what did we learn from that process? Basically, yes, that there was crazy state variations that exist in inspections and auditing. Another thing that came up in those state-by-state walkthrough was if the same person was going to be doing audits, was going to be doing inspections, and how if that was also the same person who did a non-farm readiness review, how that was confusing growers because they didn't understand what one was versus the other, even though there was an attempt to make things very clear. We need more access to buyer opinions, that there were only a couple buyers who joined us last year, so to expand on, and they are those who have been doing quite a bit in the world of food safety, and so there's this huge range of buyers who haven't necessarily tackled food safety yet or are just getting into it. And so there was a request to have more buyer opinions. And then growers have audit fatigue was another big one that came up, that with a lot of different audit schemes and inspections and opportunities through those avenues, that growers had voiced concern about receiving multiple audits in order to access multiple different markets. And so those were sort of the highlights that came out of the conversation last year in terms of needs. And so then this group stepped back and say, okay, so what do we need to do in order to address those specific things? And these were the next steps that were articulated in that conversation. We need to work on outreach to buyers, and it was clear that community level outreach is the most effective way to do that. And so having buyers who work directly with individuals within their community to understand the buying atmosphere was the most effective way to do it, rather than trying to address the buying community on a regional scale. Work on a document that state has room for states to update with their regulations on inspections and auditing. So the other thing that was discovered in that walkthrough on the state level was that this was not confirmed. A lot of it was, this is what we're doing now, this is what we think we're going to be doing, or we haven't really decided yet, but we think we're going to be inspecting 10% of our farms each year, but we'll figure that out as we get there. And so there was a lot of not only variability, but uncertainty in how that would actually look going forward. We couldn't say that that snapshot in time last year was what the region looked like in terms of inspections. And so there was clarity that we needed to be able to update whatever sort of resource we develop. We need to update it on a regular basis so that we know that it's actually still representing what's going on at the state level. And then the last next step that was identified is, if states are not doing an annual certification, what are they doing to help growers meet their market access requirements? So from this, okay, so I just wanted to highlight this, and this is then what we took out of the meeting last year and went forward with this buyer handbook grant proposal, which is what we'll talk about here in the next section. But I wanted to just give this and see if there was any questions or points of clarity from those who were in the room last year that wanted to add to this. Any additional thoughts? Hans, did you want to add
Everyone get up and dance. That's not the thought I was going to add. But just raise your hand if you were here last year. It'd be a good half of you. Looks like we're here last year. So that's great. Enough that we're not reinventing the wheel, but we got some fresh blood.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, so you're hearing some feedback because we have a go-to webinar meeting going for some buyers who are joining virtually the conversation who couldn't join us. So that's why you're hearing that feedback, because we're connected through the telephone. Okay. Great, so thank you for that. I'm just gonna plow through to funding, is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick
Yeah.
question? Could you give us like a thumbnail summary of these buyer requirements? So we've talked a lot about what's going on the regulatory state side and everything, but for those of us who weren't here last year, I think this is a large gulf of information. So is there a
Sure.
thumbnail sketch of what buyers are looking for and where the thinking is coming from?
Yeah, so the discussion last year, and like I said, last year there were 2 buyers who were part of the conversation. So the discussion was that, and Steve, you can provide clarity if you would like on this since you were there, that was that buyers are asking for audits, a variety of audits, depending on if some gaps, some H gaps, some state accreditation audits, depending on what state they're working in. They're willing to work with the state accreditation program. If there's a state that doesn't have it, it might be the federal, so GAPS or HGAP, or a third party, Primus, something like that. Alternatively, one of the buyers who was here last year said that's what they like to use, but they are willing to explore accepting a state certification for a FSMA inspection as a buying requirement. And so there was just a lot of discussion about that there's a lot of opportunity for buyers to choose and work with different states and different voluntary accreditation schemes. And that's something that they're doing. They're being flexible, but to better understand the landscape, it was an important piece of it. So one of the pieces that came out of the discussion is that there'll be requests of growers for specific market-based items. Like, let's say, they might say to a grower in Maine, I want a FSMA certificate for you to sell to my store, but you're not offering a certificate. So, and it's not because necessarily the buyer doesn't know. It's mostly a lack of communication. So it's an instance where the buyer might not realize that Maine's not providing a certificate. And so it's not that they're just asking for something that they can't get. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, I think Michael's eye, I'm seeing your hand.
Yeah, I just want to provide a little bit more context because that's
Yeah.
a moving target, right? So it's not as binary as we're presenting it for this handbook. So over the last several weeks, you've had communications from Hannaford's outlet, and also from Whole Foods, Amazon Fresh, that is throwing on new layers and new requirements. So combinations of things, the stereo programs, passives for leafy greens, they've expanded those categories in some cases. So for Hannaford's leafy greens now includes kale and Swiss chard. So, this is a moving target. A lot of it is not based on reality. We had a grower in Massachusetts that had a HACCP plan for fiddleheads. It's hilarious. There's no control point. You're foraging.
I can argue with that.
You're foraging. Well, foraging. So the issue is there's not any support structure to be able to provide those services for those growers. So they go to the path of least resistance, which is call someone that they got a name from someone and they can get that certificate. So trying to fit in the services that each state provides for market inspections, I think it is a simple process. The bigger issue is controlling sort of this new trend where folks are throwing out things that may not fit into either scheme, inspection and or audit, and then who's providing those services if we head down that path.
Yeah, and so, that's great, thank you. That's a good point. And so let me jump into this, and I think it'll provide a bit more, I hope, guidance to what the goal of this is. So, as a result of the meeting last year, we submitted a grant to the Food Safety Outreach Program, and we were awarded in 2019 to develop an online buyer handbook. And the goal of this handbook is specifically to outline produce safety standards in the Northeast. And so both voluntary and required produce safety standards. And so the idea of this is not to persuade buyers to choose one type of market access request over another. Rather, it is to outline all of the produce safety standards, both voluntary and regulatory, in one location, so that a buyer could go to the handbook, choose a state, and open it up to see what is the state of New Hampshire doing when it comes to produce safety. So if a buyer is going into the state of New Hampshire to buy something, they can say, okay, a grower in New Hampshire would have access to these types of either audits or inspection specifics. And so what this proposal, there was, like I said, these were the three things that came out of the group from last year. These are the three areas that it aims to address: buyer perspective on audits versus inspections, audit fatigue for producers, and education to buyers is paramount. So the long-term goal of this project, of the Buyer Handbook project, is articulated to provide a sustainable, comprehensive produce safety online handbook that will assist produce buyers in navigating the range of FSMA audit and inspection schemes that may apply to their supplying producers. And so this is intended for buyers, but certainly could be a resource for growers to use, that they could go and when they're communicating with a buyer, if someone, if they were to be called by a buyer, they could go into this handbook and look and see, actually, these are the things that are relevant to my state, and so let's have a conversation about what is actually available to me. And then the other thing is that it should help facilitate communication between buyers and growers.
And I'll add that if you're a service provider or regulator working with buyers or growers, you're also a potential audience that could help in your work.
Yeah, and so the objectives of this proposal are to articulate all relevant state and federal specific produce safety standards and cross-calibrate, develop an online handbook that's specifically based on produce standards, extend the project results through education and outreach, and then evaluate and assess the project. So what do each of those specifically mean? So if we look at the first two objectives, what we have in the proposal is to summarize individual state accreditation schemes, FSMA implementation process for states within the Northeast, and federal audits and cross-calibrate, and then summarize existing buyer-relevant educational efforts. And then for the second one of developing the handbook, this is intended to be a crowdsourced with limited fields for account holders to update. So the idea is that we would first build it with all the information that we have and receive that are relevant to these topics, but then it would be maintained by individuals out in the field who are in direct knowledge of that information. And it would generate a prompt, either depending on what would be necessary, but it could be every 6 months or it could be every year, for them to just validate that that information is still accurate, so that we know that the resource remains up to date over time. So what I want to do is I kind of just want to back up, because this sounds a little bit broad, and the thing is that the idea of this is in fact that this is what we summarized in our grant. And so for those of you who've written grant proposals, you know that you write it very broadly and then you kind of figure it out as you go along, and you create something that best fits the audience. And so that's the intent of this group today, and this conversation, is to actually describe amongst ourselves and decide what do these actually mean, and how do we best capture this information in a way that's useful to our growers and to our buyers. And so the main thrust is that we want to be collecting every state's individual state implementation specifics, as well as any state accreditation things and federal accreditation, so that an individual could go to a specific state and select it, and then are just presented with the information that's relevant to that state. But that it's comprehensive enough so that they understand what material they're actually looking at, or what information is available in that state. And so that's part of the conversation, is what does that actually look like? We could be as basic as saying, the state of Vermont is not providing a certificate, but that's probably not helpful. So we want to be able to provide a bit more information about what's actually happening in each state, so that buyers who are making these decisions, what kinds of things are they considering? What kinds of things are driving the decisions they're making when they're requesting growers of these types of validations or of verifications? What kinds of things will they be saying to themselves, oh, I want to make sure that transportation is an element in what my growers are doing, and now I can see that that's something that is being looked at by the state of Vermont when they're doing an inspection program. I don't know if that is it actually, like, that's just an example that I pulled out of thin air, so that's not. But the idea is that they can then say, oh, okay, now I know that the Massachusetts program does look specifically at traceability. I don't need to ask them to now go and do an additional HGAP audit, because I know that the state accreditation program that they have is covering the things that I'm interested in from a buying perspective. So that's the kind of thing that we need to tease out. We need to understand what are those decision-making points, what are those things, and then also from a grower perspective, what are the things that growers are thinking about when they're communicating this with buyers? And how can we be sure that we're providing the relevant information in this tool so that when people are having conversations and when they're making decisions, they can make effective decisions and know that accepting a certain type of audit or accepting a certain type of verification from the state is then still, validating that the buyer is getting safe food. So I'm going to stop there for a second and see if there are questions about this. And I just want to sort of reiterate, as I put in the agenda, this is a blank slate. This is literally what the activity says in the proposal, and we need to build it out to be effective and helpful to everybody. So are there any questions before I keep going on that?
How long's the grant cycle?
It's 2 years.
2 years, and what's the total budget?
150. And we do have our money.
Okay.
Yeah, we're one of the lucky ones.
And I know the grant is focused on an online buyer handbook. Is there room for paper handbooks as well?
Yeah, so it's a good
Sure.
question, and that would be something to think that we would need to talk about. So the idea with the online one is so that it doesn't immediately become out of date if it's printed. But one of the things that we have is here, extend our project through education and outreach. And so we do have money in the budget for printing and other types of educational materials. And so understanding what those look like and what would be most useful to those who do outreach and education to buyers would be important to know too. So yes, we have the ability, it's just defining what would be valuable to the group. Yes, I'll just show these are the activities associated with education and outreach and then evaluation.
Elizabeth, I have
Yeah.
a question or a comment. I kind of feel like this is going to be overkill.
Okay.
For instance, in our state, Rutgers has a website that has all that information. I'm finishing up our website that will have all that information. Now you'll have a book that has that information. So Steve, where are you going to look for that information?
Apparently I have a lot of options. And I'll be honest with you, we've reached out to all the states already. I mean, I think we have a pretty good relationship, and I think it's kind of on the buyers to have that relationship with each of the states, because obviously in the New England area especially, there's been some states that have taken on, the responsibility of the audits and moved away a little bit from the USDA audits. So for me, it's just been able to build relationships with those states and find out what each of them are doing, and what works for us, and if we have some concerns, we've been able to work through them as well. So that's kind of where we are.
So Chris,
One response to is that because this is a blank slate, at this point, it's not overkill yet. So that's really important to remember, because there are states doing great things, and maybe what this amounts to is actually a place where there's a regional pilot trying to get oriented, and it's actually linked directly, it feeds into the state resources. Maybe it's that easy, or that's a big part of what we're doing, which is not a huge lift, right? But, yeah, so I think we need to keep an open mind at this point about what kind of tool actually is.
Right, I'm just looking for like the confusion. So if you have a regional buyer, he's going to look to go to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or whatever. At one point, there's going to be just too much, and as we all know, we're on the internet, we get frustrated, and then it's just like,
forget, I hate to get in the middle of Hans and Christian, but to split the difference here, I do think, I agree with Steve, I think we have a good relationship with all our buyers, every retailer, most wholesalers, we talk routinely, not just once a year. Having said that, more and more, we have buyers who aren't in the region, so we're dealing, decision-making centers are moving away from the Northeast, not towards it. So we're on the phone with Texas often now. And that's a little bit more of a challenge in terms of them understanding what we're doing. So I do see the tool being useful in that capacity. As decision-making centers sort of displaced, it could be useful.
Yeah, and
And
the
not
other-
necessarily redundant, so.
Yeah, and the other thing is like, there are certainly states who have a lot of those resources available, but that's not every state. And so being able to sort of populate that also across the region, and I think the value of having it in one location too, is so they don't have to go to every state's website to find the information. But it's a good point, and I appreciate that thought. We certainly do not want to overkill. I mean, it's meant to be, as as possible, yeah.
I'm Audrey, I work for the USDA.
Oh, hi, Audrey.
And I just want to tell you a little bit about a sort of project that we're working on that sort of runs simultaneous to this, although we didn't really know that this project was going to be when this happened, for buyer engagement. So we are reaching out to nationwide to buyers to get this in partnership with an institution who's going to do the research for us, to get a better handle of what buyers are doing when it comes to produce safety in sourcing. Are they accepting inspections, audits? If they are doing, if they're accepting audits, which audits they're going to do, and what they're going to accept. Then part of that is also why, how they make those decisions, what it is exactly they're looking for, where they're getting their knowledge about what they should be asking of their suppliers. Additionally, we're asking about if we're talking to a nationwide company or somebody with wide reach, how they're communicating that or how they're having those discussions with their regional purchasers. So we're trying to sort of gather a lot of that information from the buyer side of things, which then you guys may be able to use in what exactly you're putting up on the webpage.
Yeah, thanks. This is a good conversation. Any other comments or questions? Before we jump in. This is basically what I wanted to do to introduce the project to you. But just to also say that, it's not to, it's really a collection of the work that's already happening. It's not to create new programs or to create any new expectations, but rather just summarize everything into one location so that it's useful for those coming to the information. Hans or Wes, do you want to add anything to that? I heard
I have some questions, yeah, in terms of, and I guess I can direct it at Hans and Wes, is there going to be, in terms of the educational materials in support of this for buyers, what are we thinking about, like trainings or? Like
No, so it was mostly gonna be just awareness about
Okay.
about the handbook.
Or links to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that'll be part of the conversation later this afternoon about what sort of local educational initiatives and how can we incorporate
Okay.
material into what's already happening regionally. What would you like to have and what would you use? Not doing any type of training or anything like that.
If we can leave today with